Hello and welcome to the SciFirst MovieTalk episode. So in this episode, I'm discussing the 1958 British disaster drama A Night to Remember, as directed by Roy Ward Baker and as based on Walter Lord's 1955 non-fiction book of the same name, both chronicling the sinking of the RMS Titanic on the 15th of April 1912. After only recently watching James Cameron's 1997 Oscar-winning adaptation of those tragic events that unfolded that infamous night, I was in a pretty nostalgic mood, and I had a kind of a yearning to kind of step back in time somewhat and revisit another movie I had loved growing up, dramatising that very same event, that being the movie subject to this review, A Night to Remember. Learning about the Titanic and the travesty that kind of befell her and her passengers, forgive the reference to gender, this is how historically the Titanic and, ships in general have been referred. And although I do usually prefer a more generic approach, I thought given the film was released in 1958, kind of seemed more retrospective touch, and then kind of in keeping with the tone and ethos of the time, befitting of the Titanic and her stature and revered status. But indeed, learning, about the Titanic has always been quite the fascination. There is a sort of morbid curiosity, I think, surrounding the disaster, but I think even to this day, very much a disbelief that such a tragedy could ever have occurred in the first place, and how so many events could have transpired to create such a perfect storm of utter despair, and one of the biggest and most tragic shipping disasters to have ever taken place in our history. And this movie kind of fits into this fascination quite well, kind of being created from kind of first-hand accounts of the events as based on Walter Lord's book, mixed with a number of fictional characters which help provide a focus and assistance in telling the story from a narrative perspective, taking what could have been a documentary-style approach into something much more compelling as a drama. The movie primarily follows the crew of the Titanic as we witness events from their point of view, including its second officer, Charles Herbert Lightoller, as played by Kenneth More, who, whilst actually playing somebody who was aboard the Titanic at the time, also plays a role that kind of amalgamates a number of other people and roles, of whom had the potential to have been aboard the Titanic when she sank, which does kind of offer some continuity from a storytelling perspective, maybe not from a factual one. As we move from every missed opportunity to avert disaster, each accumulates into this snowball of kind of content. It's hard to kind of comprehend just how in the world just a series of events would transpire, yet each inevitably leads up to that heart-rending moment that the Titanic is struck by the iceberg. And then, if this wasn't bad enough, we then have the calamity that ensues as the ship's officers scramble in confusion and dumbfoundment in the chaos in order to get as many people off the ship as possible, much often to their annoyance and total ignorance. For many, A Night to Remember was and still remains, even in the event of Cameron's 1997 Titanic masterpiece, considered to be one of the most historically accurate portrayals of the Titanic tragedy. There are a few notable exceptions, not least the fact that many of the characters portrayed in the film, for either legal reasons or artistic license, have either been changed from their real-life counterparts, renamed, or simply omitted. It is in the end not intended to be a true kind of factual representation. And interestingly, as the film was made prior to the Titanic actually being discovered in 1985, they didn't know that the ship had kind of split in half. And so, like many of the films and TV serials depicting the Titanic up to that time, the Titanic sinks as a whole. But like I said, this was the general consensus as to actually what happened to the ship at that time. The movie does examine the scale and the scope of the voyage, the vessel in a factual way. But that's, one that's still really quite compelling. Everything's prim and proper, very British, stiff upper lip, carry on old chaps. And to be honest, if indeed much of the night did in fact play out like it's shown in the film, people's ignorance, class and attitudes played a very heavy part in contributing to the travesty which, are some of the most annoying and frustrating elements of the errors that were made. What's interesting is that in some way we do get to see the human condition in action, how each person would have actually reacted in such circumstances, regardless in the end of class. Some will choose to stand up for what's right. Some will look out for number one. Some may turn to drink. Some will look to reflect on life and love. What's clear is that many stood to lose their entire life. Their whole families were aboard, their possessions, and the film kind of makes it clear, to kind of, it makes a clear play, to kind of unsettle our nerves in this respect, with some of the more poignant scenes playing into this, especially some of the goodbyes between family members who knew, they must have known, heart in heart, that they were never going to see each other again. Beyond devastating. It's clear that the film was designed, or at least used, as a vehicle for Kenneth More, and at first someone who I thought was quite the odd choice, being quite a, from what I've seen in the past, other movies that he's been in, such as Doctor in the House, Doctor at Large, being quite the character with a kind of a quick sense of sarcastic wit. Perhaps not quite the right reverence for the role. Kind of akin to seeing like kind of Leslie Nielsen playing the captain, or the ship's captain if you like, in the 1972 disaster movie Poseidon. However, he plays well against the initial awe and inspiration the Titanic portrays. Everybody is proud of the technical achievement Titanic represents, and this is certainly conveyed in Moore's performance. Yet along with the rest of the cast, presents a sincere solemnness, portentously dignified portrayal that kind of yields and kind of respect and solicitude to the subject matter in hand. Interestingly, and this is something I had noted years ago and there at first, when we'd kind of watched the two films practically side by side previously, although nobody's believed me, is just how similar elements of 1997's Titanic actually are to this movie, to the point that it would almost feel like Titanic itself was a remake of A Night to Remember, or at least paying homage to it in a number of subtle but cleverly kind of placed ways. Now, I've not heard anything to this effect, but the similarities are absolutely uncanny. Sometimes it's themes such as a dance in third class. Sometimes it's actual scenes and moments that are almost the exact same composition, or even, in some cases, the exact same dialogue. Indeed, I don't actually seem to be alone, thankfully, on this train of thought. I have actually seen a few videos of people saying the exact same thing. But of course, to some extent, both films show the same tragedy, with the same sequence of events, and mostly the same characters, and so you kind of expect a little bit of similarity to kind of present itself in the two notions. Second to that, it actually turns out, which makes a lot more sense, that Walter Lord, who'd originally penned A Night to Remember, also served as a consultant to Cameron whilst making the Titanic. So, that would indeed explain a lot, I think. Either way, as I've said, uncanny. I do often wonder, however, that just how it would work if we kind of mix James Horner's score from Titanic with some of the visuals from A Night to Remember. Especially his themes as we kind of move into the Titanic at the beginning and as that kind of iceberg hits. I think it would be pretty cool. If my editing skills were actually much better, it might be something that I actually do try out. A Night to Remember, however, has no score at all. I didn't realise this up until kind of pinpointing it for this review. There wasn't there, apart from a few moments of a more incidental music that we had, which in itself certainly sets a more eerie kind of atmosphere. At times you can hear a pin drop through the tension. Either way, it is still a captivating watch, delving more into the mechanisms of the disaster and the failure modes involved, which are fascinating. And indeed, it's also kind of interesting to see the events play out as they might have done on the other two ships involved. And so if I get this right, the Carpathia, which eventually went to Titanic's aid, but much too late, unfortunately, and the Californian, which tragically was the closest ship in range, and would have been able to save a great deal more many souls. But if it didn't keep a radio vigil at the time, or at the most crucial time. The sheer fear, the panic, I think this movie excellently explores as best as it could for the time. What it might have been like to be aboard the Titanic at that time. And it's so hard to imagine such anguish, such a large-scale travesty. But of course, they all just didn't stand around just waiting to die. It must have been terrifying. And for those in the boats not being able to do anything, just having to sit and watch all of those souls, 1,000+ people slowly going to their death, is beyond any trauma I could ever envisage. And I think this is what this movie certainly brings to the table. A clear direction and focus on the events, and the fact that it doesn't choose to hold back even for its time. I think I would like to say it's an over-dramatisation, but in reality, it probably doesn't go quite far enough. The sense of loss the movie portrays is nerve-shattering and incomprehensible, and it's a feeling that does simply rock you to the core. Overall, this is somewhat a very technically presented movie, examining more the mechanisms that led up to the sinking of the Titanic, particularly from the point of view of the crew, building up and detailing the tragic events, or the series of events if you like, and missed opportunities that are simply heartbreaking to witness. Every event compounds the errors, and it's carefully detailed in this respect with a very dramatic approach. The movie was one of the most lavish and indeed pretty much the most expensive productions ever made in the UK at that time. And it's clear that no expense was spared in creating a kind of a realistic story with integrity and sincerity, yielding a powerful sentiment and reverence for the plight and suffering of all of those involved. In fact, Tonight to Remember was one of the first major motion disaster motion pictures of its kind and of the scale for its time. And although not initially successful itself, it paved the way for many more such movies to follow, providing this kind of template that has now been used many, many times over in the genre. Poseidon as well, being one of them. It does have a functional feel, perhaps, but there's certainly an attempt to bring a human element into the story. A focus, if you like, amidst the backdrop of the disaster in hand. The characters themselves, I would say, are kind of fleeting. There's too many players to really kind of go into any depth. But it works for what it kind of certainly trying to achieve. And in this, it will always be a movie that is, it remains very close to my heart. So, that brings me to the end of this episode. Many thanks for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please leave a like. Please do hit that subscribe button for more movie reviews, trailer reactions, and other movie-related content. Absolutely loved having you at SciFirst MovieTalk, and definitely love to have you back. Most of all, just thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.